Congratulations, everyone. You completed your first debate, either as a debater or a judge, or as an attentive audience member. So good job. It was a good debate. I enjoyed it. So now I'm going to just give a run-through of each kind of performance in the debate, and then I'll talk about some general things we should consider for debating in general, some things to improve upon, some things that you might want to consider about strategy, and then also maybe some arguments that you might want to think about in relationship to this specific debate that could further the debate or take it in a different direction. So beginning with Russell's speech. So Russell, I think you did a good job of setting up the debate, which is obviously your role as being the Prime Minister. And you kind of give us these nice 4 different kind of general points that are problems with homeschooling. So there's a lack of standardized curriculum. There's the lack of qualification of the parents as teachers. The special needs students don't get the recognition otherwise, and that parents impose their beliefs. And these are the 4 kind of major points of clash in the debate. So you did a really good job of identifying what are the most important arguments in the debate and making these right in your first speech. So one thing that you might want to, you took a lot of points of information. You took, I think, 5 points of information. And so this is definitely something that you want to take fewer than 5. You want to take 2. But especially in the first speech, you kind of have room to only take 1, because you really want to develop a kind of full sense of what the principle of your team is. So one of the things that you might think about is what kind of connects these 4 different points. Is there a principle that underlies all of them? So one of the things that you might think about is like, well, what here? There seems to be a lot of focus on the teachers, right? But how does it relate to kind of what is the purpose of education? And we get this kind of, we kind of get a little splash of it, and you kind of tell us that the purpose of education is to prepare people for college. And no one really does much with you on this one, though they could, because the purpose of education is to prepare you for college, as is pointed out later in the debate, not everyone goes to college. But they don't really make this an attack against you. But it also is kind of a weak principle of education, because college itself, I hope, for us, is also part of education. So this isn't really a principle of education in general for a society. It's kind of maybe something that some people aspire to, so the more work on the formulation of the principle of education maybe would help to unify all of these arguments. So that's something to think about. What's the principle of our team? Why, as a good government, would we want to ban homeschooling? What is the purpose of schooling in our society? And these become arguments that are taken up later in the debate, and maybe if you had taken them, you could have had a higher ranking in the judge's eyes in this debate. So something to think about. Something a little bit more specific about some of your arguments. So the first one, you say lack of standardized curriculum. You give 2 examples. You're like, well, if someone's an accountant, they might be focusing more on math. Someone's a biologist, they might focus more on science. And these aren't bad examples, but they're not necessarily the best examples, because the people that we want to think about like real examples, right? Or examples that are the most plausible. And it's not so plausible that someone that is a highly specialized, highly trained professional in a field is going to be someone who's homeschooling their child, right? So what are the motivations of people who motivate their children? We can bring this right away into an example. What are the kinds of things that these people would focus on? What are people saying in the kind of the discourse about homeschooling? So rather than your example being kind of like a general sense that people are not good at everything all at once, we want to have a kind of real discussion, or not, I shouldn't say a real discussion, but something specific about what are the real motivations of people who homeschool as being part of your examples. And that should be something that you're always thinking about. What are the motivations of the actors involved, and what are the most plausible accounts of those motivations? I think you have a good argument here, though, that and this is one that's not really developed very strongly in the debate, and could be more, and this could be a bigger point for you too, is that one of the principles of education and public education is that children should find what interests them. So that a parent who's kind of, so the standardized curriculum actually is good, not just because it allows different professionals to be in different roles, so that you have a math teacher, a biologist, but because it is so spread out, it allows a child moving through it to find what kind of really inspires them. And I want to hear more about how that might work differently in a homeschooling situation. So the response to the cyber schools, are they under homeschooling, that I think Oliver gives you? I think you want to just take the hard line and say either yes they are, and not like, well, there's this caveat of an extreme bullying situation, or be like, that's just immaterial to the debate. We're not talking about that. So you just want to take a hard line and take a hard stance, and don't let him kind of weasel in on these kinds of special bullying circumstances, which you really do open yourself up there, I think, for maybe more than is taken advantage of. But you don't want to kind of say, well, okay, maybe bullying is a reason we want to homeschool, because you're banning homeschooling, right? You're trying to defend a ban, which is kind of the most complete legislative action you can take. So you don't want to right away give away some kind of ground for someone to say, well, even he admits, blah, blah, blah. So bans should be defended strongly, usually, in a debate as being kind of as total as could justifiably be defended. What else do you say here? So I think that you do a good job. Okay, also about the parents imposing beliefs, we don't get a whole lot because you're taking mostly POIs at this point. But I think that the example of the German family here's something that we could all think about together, which is a kind of, well, what is the situation in Germany that led to the banning of homeschooling, and why did they flee to America? Yes, it's legal to homeschool here, but maybe by thinking about some of the kinds of global questions about homeschooling, this would be an example that would allow us to think globally about this issue rather than just to think in the American context. What are the kind of concerns? Because I think that that's something that's going to be challenging for us all the time. We will revert to an American example. So I think it's good that you brought in a non-American example, but the kind of flesh on that example is left pretty, you just kind of mention it as an example. So I want to kind of see the example developed something stronger. So good job, though. Okay, so leader of opposition. I think you come out with a strong, this is Oliver, I think you come out with a strong principle here, which is really good. You're like, we are defending parents' rights. We're defending parents' rights. But then you move immediately into this kind of like narrowing of the field. You're like, we will not compare different types of schooling. And I think that this is, I think I see what you're doing. You're trying to say like, well, we want to take like a hardcore stance just on our principle of that the right in itself is something that's justifiable. But I think that once the debate is about comparing these kinds of education, right? You want to be part of that debate because otherwise you'll become irrelevant to it. So you don't want to limit your options right from the get-go, right? You might want to say that even as we compare this, what we should really keep in mind is the principle of rights, but you don't have to let go of this one kind of gesture, this one kind of weapon that you have, which is the comparison of the schools. And in fact, you don't anyway, because you end up making lots of comparisons. Both members of also Courtney, both members of opening opposition. So it's not a strong strategy, and it's a strategy that tries to narrow the debate. But really, what it is narrow you as a team and what you're possible to do. But so I think that you should just stick with the principle and not try to like collect all of the possible meanings of it before anyone else gets a chance to deal with it. Yeah. So, but I think that your principle is also fleshed out nicely with this example of every tool has its appropriate use, and that sometimes you would want to use you want to have a toolbox kind of approach, right? This is a nice principle, and that but it doesn't necessarily gel quite the same with the discourse of rights. So you don't actually develop a discourse of rights here. So your principle is strong, I think, in kind of my intuition of what it means. But what is a right, and why would parents have a right to homeschooling is not something that you really kind of develop. You do end up kind of giving us advantages of homeschooling, which is what you told us you would do. So this is why I think there's this kind of weird tension at the beginning between what you're standing for, what you're doing, because you give us the principle, you tell us what you're not doing, and you give us kind of a like utilitarian model of like we should just have a bunch of options available to us. And rights seem to be something different than that to me. But you have some really good arguments, and they're arguments that I think stay in the debate even though they're not always accredited to you. But they kind of come in these weird triune pairs to the point that it almost becomes distracting that I keep hearing these triune pairs of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I don't know what that's about, but it seems kind of like a tick to list things in threes. So unless there's a reason for that, you want to kind of maybe like just think about it as an attention problem, maybe drawing your attention away from other things. So you said that the goal of education is has these three parts to it: to receive an education, to be productive members of society, and emotional well-being. And I think it would be nice to develop different lines of argument from each of these, and you kind of do. But the next thing we get are like, what is homeschooling? So you kind of redefine homeschooling, and that seems to take you away from where the argument was going. And then also people use that against you. They're later on, they're like, this isn't really what they tried to redefine homeschooling. This is not what what we're talking about. So it makes you less relevant to the debate. Some of your best arguments, though, is the stuff about the academically gifted and the disabled. And I actually think, even though the judges said that the severe food allergies was weak, I think that they were right. It was weak. It's one of the most interesting things that's said in the debate. But you just signal it. So once you get to tell us what homeschooling is, you just start signaling these arguments. I think it's because you're reading stuff. You like have lots of good research. You have lots of good weapons, and you are just showing them to us. You're like, here's my weapon. Here's my dagger. Here's my knife. You're showing us all your weapons, but you're not using them. So you need to think about maybe just picking a couple of them and be like, here's why severe food allergies is a real problem. This is what it looks like in the life of someone who has a severe food allergy, and how public schooling, when it becomes the only way one can get an education, the kinds of things that happen to someone with severe health, risks of transport, all of these kinds of things. You could really get much more textured kind of detail with these arguments that you're laying out before us, but you're just kind of signaling them, and then people either are going to take them from you and do something more interesting with them, or they're going to ignore them. So signaling your arguments is actually giving them away. This is how you should think about it. Okay, and also both members of the opening opposition have an argument that I think is weak and that no one did much against. But this idea that there's no financial harm to public schools. One thing is strange because it's framed as an argument against some kind of argument that they have made, but they haven't made this argument. So it seems like you were preparing a rebuttal, but you don't want to give a rebuttal to an argument that wasn't made, unless there's you're going to tell us why this is really important to the debate. So it just kind of seems strange, and it also doesn't seem right to me. I mean, I think that potentially homeschooling. No one really makes this in the debates. This is just my kind of thought about it. Potentially homeschooling does have some kind of negative effects on the institution of public schooling because of, anyway, that's not really important, but it doesn't seem like it's part of the debate. Okay, so the Deputy Prime Minister. So Dale, you begin by saying, just to reiterate. No, you don't need to reiterate anything. Don't need to tell us the motion. No one should begin by saying the motion because it's just a waste of time. Everyone who's there knows the motion. So you should begin by, this is the first time someone gets to hear from you. And you might want to think about it as kind of a palate cleansing moment. So they've just heard a bunch of stuff from the opposing side. So you want to cleanse the palate of your audience by giving them something kind of nice and sweet, like a gelato. And being like, here's something nice and sweet for the awesomeness that's about to come, my filet mignon. But not, here's the motion again, because this is feels like you're being handed a piece of paper and we're getting into a form, we're doing something bureaucratic. And it's not how the rest of your speech is either. So this is I know it's a really small point, but it's an important point because the first part of your speech is a really powerful moment. Structurally in a speech can be a really powerful moment in a speech. So you don't want to give up that opportunity. So your evidence here is quite anecdotal. And this can be very powerful, but can also be kind of dangerous. So it's something to consider about what kinds of, how to use anecdotal evidence. So this is what I'm going to talk about mostly with your speech, Dale. So you talk about how your parents are specialists, and this kind of reminded me of Russell's thing about the biologist and the accountant. I was like, okay, so your counterfactuals are all, your anecdotes are all counterfactual. You're like, if my parents had homeschooled me, this is what would have happened. If my grandmother had homeschooled me, I would have been more racist or something like this. I'm not really sure. So it's kind of a confusing argument because a counterfactual argument implies that we follow a train of history or follow a train of kinds of implications from an action that didn't occur. And these are sometimes necessary arguments. But it doesn't seem like the kind of complex intuiting and inferences that an audience is put through in a counterfactual situation are required here. Because we have real examples of people being homeschooled. And it seems like you're running away to these other examples that are counterfactual. And it's a confusing moment for me as to why you're doing this, other than maybe it's something that you're kind of familiar with. You're familiar with these experiences of your life. And then you have this one other kind of example, the misspelled name. And there's something about it that kind of makes me uncomfortable. And I think it's because it's racialized. I think it's coded as a racial thing. And it kind of makes it seem like there are certain people that are not qualified to teach their children, but that takes on like a racial connotation or a kind of class connotation, and it doesn't seem like you need to do this because, again, in this case, this woman was not attempting to homeschool her child. So it seems to take us away from what the matter at hand into a kind of evidential problem that may also have implications for members of the audience that are not things that you want to kind of deal with. So do you want to, especially when you're doing anecdotes, right? Especially when you're bringing up personal experience, the connotations of that are very important. And even more so when you're doing counterfactuals. So you're kind of like, with a counterfactual anecdote that is, that you're using as most of your evidence, this opens you up to lots of kind of connotative meanings, more so than if you use kind of more concrete or more seemingly pertinent examples. And that's kind of dangerous because whatever people pick up there is now attached to you, right? So you might be like, well, I didn't mean any of this stuff, but that kind of strategy of opening up the counterfactual opens up kind of connotation. So it's something to be very strategic about, and not something you want to use liberally. It's like a fine spice, the counterfactual, and you want to use it very. It has a strong flavor, so you don't want to use it too much. It's going to overpower your arguments. So that's stuff about counterfactuals. You do have some good stuff in here about. I think the best thing. Okay, one other thing is, and this happens, it's interesting because you and Courtney parallel each other's structure and when she's rebutting you. Because you say, another thing is, another thing is, another thing is. And then Courtney says, another thing is, because she's rebutting you. So that's a good example of, weirdly, you almost kind of trapped Courtney into your style in a way that probably hurt her. But it's not good for you either, because your organization just kind of seems like, it's just kind of joined together artificially. And you want to try to think about how you can, and this is an advanced kind of argumentation strategy. But you want to think about how the way you organize your arguments will kind of parallel the kind of reasoning or the kind of story that you want your audience to follow, to the point that it seems very obvious that you would start here and you would end here, rather than you would be like the kind of laying out again. You're not signaling your arguments, but you're kind of just like, here they are, they're just next to each other. And we don't know why this one came before this one. So something to think about is arrangement. But I think your best arguments are the stuff about the parent-child interaction. You kind of just mentioned this, and you mentioned it as a question. Are these parent-child interactions, or these interactions between adults? So there's this, and I think it implies a really important principle that you could have developed, which is that one of the ways that people come to adulthood in modern advanced liberal democracies, or whatever that we're talking about, is through the public school system, because at a certain point the teachers transition and begin to teach the students as if they were adults, or as if they were kind of young adults. This might not be true, but something like this, right? They treat them with a kind of maturity that they don't get treated with at home. And that we could really doubt whether any parent would be capable of this kind of changing of roles back and forth. But I want to hear more analysis about like what that distinction of the role is between parent and teacher, or parent or adult to adult, or parent to student. What the significance of that relationship is for a whole society. And I think it's like a provocative question, but it's not developed into argumentation. It's kind of mentioned as a question, and it's provocative, but I'm doing all the work of thinking about what the principle is that's underneath that. So more could be done there. Okay, so Courtney, we already talked a little bit about you, but I think that one of the things that you want to do is you want to show what your line is. So one of the things that the second speaker, especially on the top of the house, they want to pull from what their partner has said. Now especially the DLO, because they've heard what all of the kind of opening government has said, so that their argumentation is finished, more or less. And they have to prepare for what the closing government might say, right? So what you want to kind of do is like, you're the launching pad for the back half of the debate. You want us to remember your team as having a kind of strong principle, right? So as you develop your new argumentation, you want to show us what from Oliver's speech, you might want to like crystallize it and put it in a new light for us. So that as we remember Oliver through you, so that we remember the whole team. And that's kind of one of the weird parts of the partnership, is like, you kind of are like taking stuff from your partner and reworking it so that it seems like a cohesive whole. So this is something that I think you want to work on. So you kind of begin with a technical strategy, right? You're trying to clarify that what we really want is options. But I don't think that this is your strongest strategy, because even though the opening government hasn't really engaged with this part of your argument yet, Oliver has made this point, like we should just have it as an option. They are articulating reasons for the ban, for the complete ban, so that it shouldn't be an option. So we're kind of like missing the clash a little bit here And so you're not entering in right at the point of the clash, right? So this is what you're kind of looking for. It's like, what is the point? What is the like finest point at which the arguments of both sides are in contest with each other? And it's not about, and it actually at this point it's not about whether there should be an option or whether there should be. I mean, that's what the motion is about. But you're kind of trying to clarify and be like, well, what we're really just saying is like the rights of parents, this kind of technical sense of the argument. And this is not the most strategic moment. Most strategic choice for you at the moment. So I think you have some nice arguments here about what is, okay, so this will maybe explain the stuff I just said. You have some really nice arguments here about that when you're trying to turn their arguments. I think this is like really well done. You say, well, actually the curriculum will be more expansive, right? It'll offer students more opportunities because of what is available online. But I think that the problem that you face in this, so you do a nice job of kind of showing what is available. But availability is kind of the question here, which is they are attacking, in some sense, the motivations of the people that do this, which is that they are trying to impose their beliefs, right? At least they have mentioned this. They haven't made this a kind of clear argument, but it's going to become clear, and you should expect it to become, more something that's going to be developed by the closing government too, right? These are people that want to impose their beliefs on their children. So having a bunch of stuff available doesn't necessarily mean that the people motivated to homeschool will use it, right? Because their whole motivation is to make less available. So you have to do a little bit more work showing why a homeschool education, if your argument is going to be why a homeschool education actually provides a kind of broader sense of education, more possibilities, you have to do more than the work of availability. And that is where you would find the clash, right? Which is like why maybe the point of clash is that motivations aren't to limit a student, or maybe that even in that motivation to kind of limit what a student sees, something else emerges. But I think you need to kind of engage with their stuff about the motivations of people who are homeschooling their children, even though even on their side it's kind of weakly developed, it's kind of a thread through there. But that's something you need to do. Yeah, I think you have some really good rebuttal. Not everyone goes to college, so you rebut their kind of their principle of education. Though at this point, kind of through Dale's speech, it probably would have been better to have maybe whispered that to Oliver and say that right away, right? So if the principle is something that you're attacking, you don't want to attack it 2 speeches later. You want to attack it right away. But yeah, it's a really good point. You have some stuff about sports. I think that that's good, but it's a little bit. It seems a little bit kind of like you spend a lot of time on it, and it doesn't give you a lot of offense. It's mostly a defensive argument. Like no, there are opportunities for students, but there's not a lot of offense in the sense that this isn't making us more go to your side. It's just making us be like, okay, it's not really that big of an issue. So maybe a little less time on that. And then you have a really interesting argument about the money that's tied to the test scores, and that the special needs students are encouraged to drop out. This is by far the most powerful and interesting argument that's come up in the debate so far. That special needs students are encouraged to drop out because of current policy. But it's introduced as this kind of like almost aside. You're like, oh, no, thanks to No Children Left Behind, No Child Left Behind, we have this set of policies that do this. But so it kind of is introduced somewhat in a weak manner. And then you get a kind of brutal POI from Alexa, I think, when she says, when have the students been forced out? She just asks you kind of bold-faced, and you're like, well, I have the links I could give you. And I think this is like a moment where you don't want to respond with this, be like, I have evidence like after the debate, because that just means that it's over. You've given up, right? You need to have a response to this kind of POI that even if you aren't able to say, well, here, let me name you something, you need to be able to like provide it virtually. Like, well, this is what it looks like. Imagine this. I've read a bunch of studies. This is kind of the sense that I got of what it looks like for someone whose life is who's living under the current policies that have special needs, right? These are the kinds of practices that they use to force students out. And if you don't know that, then maybe if you aren't capable of kind of like formulating that into the argument, you might not want to introduce it because they might ask you a POI, or at least not accept a POI right around that time where you're like, I'm not really sure about this, because the kind of just like straight out POI that's like, when has this happened? How does this happen? Is a really good one, given that you can't answer it, right? If she senses that you're weak on this point. So be careful about when you take the POIs, but also just like think about maybe just being like, here's what it would look like. Here's how it might work even though I can't give you a specific name of someone, right? So because this will do more imaginative work for the audience and more kind of inferential work for the audience than if you just say, I have a bunch of web links. Okay, so now back to the back half of the table. Member of government. I think that you do a good job of saying, coming right straight out and saying, this is the purpose of education. Principle. Purpose is overall well-being. This is the citizen of tomorrow, right? It's like really strong. It's like rhetorical. It's kind of general and vague, but it's at least there, and it's kind of strongly stated, right? As some of the other audience members said, the public speaking, the rhetorical delivery was strong, but it is kind of vague. And a lot of our rhetoric about education is kind of vague. It's like citizen of tomorrow, and you kind of develop this. But I think it's like it's even stronger to come out with a strong principle that is like very concrete, right? Or at least allows you to make concrete arguments from it. I think you also have a kind of nice hardcore line on the teachers, you're like, or the ways of education. You're like, some ways are better than others. And I think the best kind of turn of phrase in the debate is this: homeschooling does not create bad citizens, but public schools create better citizens. And this kind of changes the whole tenor of the debate. It's a good example of what loyalty looks like between a back half team, because I think in some ways this is your extension, right? Though you're still being loyal to the government who kind of have slammed homeschooling pretty hard, right? You're like, we don't need to say that they're bad, but we say that public schools create better citizens. And I think that is a really nice kind of way to put yourself into the debate with a different angle that actually takes some burden off of you of proving the homeschooling is bad, but also like makes you different from the top half of the debate. So, I think I actually kind of wanted to hear more about this, how we would measure the betterness of citizens, and what that means with education. Because we end up kind of going back into a kind of comparison of education, and it's not clearly articulated what it has to do with citizenship. And citizenship seems to me more like a floating signifier in the debate. It's just kind of there, and it does some kind of work for us, getting us to a kind of sense of something that's larger than education. But I don't really know what citizenship means concretely in its relationship to education. So sometimes you go a little bit maybe too hardcore, because you're like, you should just deal with the bullies, you shouldn't run away to homeschooling. And that's kind of like, if you have someone on the fence who's like, ooh, or maybe, as Courtney just said, she was homeschooled. We have people who are like talking about being homeschooled. You'd be like, homeschooling as running away from society or running away from kinds of intimidation. This might be a little bit too much of an edge in your argument. It's something to be careful of as you're kind of, because sometimes the passion of speaking changes the color of our arguments in ways that we don't feel like we're in control of. But something to kind of be aware of, that you don't want to go too hardcore to the point that you're not in control of the nature of the argument. Good argument about giving up the income of the parents. Good argument about the cyberschooling. I like this kind of strategy. Like, even though cyberschooling might technically not be part of homeschooling, we will still argue against it. This is the right strategy, right? Is to kind of signal that, like, these people have tried to introduce something into the debate that really doesn't belong there. But even so, it's a good point for this other argument that I'm going to make, which is that it's not getting the necessary social interaction. So I think that's a nice way of splitting, not trying to be noting the technical error, or noting the technical problem, but also just engaging with the argument. Not trying to get rid of arguments by a technical kind of deferral to the rules or to a definition or something. Yeah, and I think that, so I also think that you have this POI. It's kind of hard to say what happens here. This is a more interesting moment in the debate. You have the POI about the extremely competitive students lose out. And it's kind of implied that there's some kind of study about this. So I think you kind of take the wrong answer to the POI, because you're like, you again kind of go with your kind of hardcore ethos. I don't want to say wrong, but it's like, there might be a better strategy here. You're like, well, this gives them a brief glance at what the real world is like. And I'm not sure that goes with your principle of making better citizens. That the real world is a place of brutal competition, and you might lose out, but this is what the reality is like. How does this make the citizen of the future? I'm confused now about what your principle is. And then you go right back to it. You're like, the world of tomorrow, right? So the kind of like, again, I think it's kind of the like hardness of your kind of like the crispness of the rhetoric becomes a crispness in the argument that's kind of a brittleness, which is just that it's not really a well-developed kind of nuanced understanding that deals with some of the complexities of what citizenship might mean in relationship to education, and that competition might not necessarily be, or a competitive model of education may pose a kind of problem to the principle of education, whether it's success in kind of grade success or otherwise. So it's something to maybe be a little bit more generous to the POIs that you're going to be like, that's a really good point. Here's how we might deal with that. It might be kind of like a verbal gesture to make that will they'll make your arguments more nuanced. That's a really good point. Here are a couple points about that. So, but really good job. Nicely done. Member of opposition, Tyler, I really like the way that you open this up. Very nice. Ultimate Frisbee. It's very personable, and it's very clear what you're getting at. You're like, it's self-officiating. And you're also very generous. You're like, not everyone likes this. However, it has this effect. It makes us have more respect for the game. This is really nicely done, and it's a nice example of, our paradigma from Aristotle, of an argument from example that kind of transitions to an enthymeme, which is that we see the implication here, which is that if we allow people to self-officiate in certain games, this actually develops a kind of whole ethic and respect for whatever they're engaged in. So yeah, I think that this is really good. So then you begin talking about the limited curriculum of the high school, right, which is one of the major arguments. And I think that one of the best arguments here is the stuff about losing summer, the all year round versus, or kind of how scheduling matters. And I think that you can kind of present this, or like begin this by making it more distinct from other teams. And you can do this by doing certain things like, one thing that hasn't been talked about in this debate, we've had all this talk about limited curriculum. One thing that hasn't been talked about in this debate is just like very concrete things about like scheduling. And here's something about scheduling. Here's how scheduling really affects something very important about education. So it seems not important. It's really important. Students forget stuff through the whole year, but homeschooling kind of deal with this problem by offering us this way of having a schedule that maybe is not as intense every day, but that goes through the whole year. So it may provide this kind of alternative to public schooling that's really good. So you kind of want to just make that more distinct by a kind of presentational strategy from the other teams, because you have some good arguments in there. You have some, when you go into the biases, you have some argument about 75% of private, but whatever you're saying, it's unclear. Like it just was not well formed in speech, so I lost your argument. So I didn't understand your argument about biases. So be careful about when, I think you get a little caught up in the reading there at that moment, and it was just, I kind of lost what you were saying. I didn't know 75% versus 50% of what. I couldn't, it wasn't well formulated. And nice use of evidence in your stuff about the high schoolers on the tests. And this becomes a point of contention for the rest of the debate. And you have brought the most concrete evidence for it. So I think this was well done. Yeah, and then but then your extension is this thing, the negatives of banning homeschooling, which is like, your side. So your extension should be actually something smaller than this. It should be something that's kind of well contained and like has a kind of individuality that allows us to remember your team. Because you kind of go on and say a whole bunch of different things that don't give a kind of crystal point. But it's both just the negatives of banning and that it sets an un-American precedent. I have to say, I don't really buy this argument too much, the un-American precedent. Partly because I don't think it uses the term precedent in a very precise way. It kind of, you're not talking about legal precedent, you just mean like, in general, this is kind of un-American. But it seems strange to me that it would be un-American given that it's already happening in America. I don't know why it's un-American or what American means here. And it's not related to the discussion about citizenship either. And it could be, because you appeal to the First Amendment. So it just kind of seems like something that you guys had prepared to be your team line, but it didn't really go with the debate as it had developed. So rather than an extension of the debate, it kind of seemed like something that you kind of trying to force in there. And I think that this is also true for Cassandra's speech. Just kind of like, it's a little bit forced, and it's a little irrelevant, really, this kind of stuff about, because you get a really good POI. Is it really free speech from Russell, though it could be maybe not phrased just as a question, like, why this is not free speech because da-da-da. If it was framed as an argument, it might be even better. And your answer is kind of, it is free speech. But it's not clear why it's free speech. It's not clear why the First Amendment should even be defended, So none of these things are very, very clear to me. So your rebuttal is much stronger than your extension here. And then you kind of drop it again and go for very kind of pragmatic comparison stuff about autistic kids. So your extension is this kind of like moment of suggestive brilliance that ends up being kind of this weird argument about the First Amendment that doesn't really do very much. So think more about the extension and how it kind of can incorporate all of your argumentation. All right, so whip speeches. Whips were good, I think, especially for the first time. So good job, whips. So I like that the government whip. Bridget. Yeah, getting a little tired here. I'm glad that Bridget went right away and crystallized as one of the points of clash here the extension from the other team, even though it's kind of a small extension, as I just mentioned. This idea about it being un-American. You have really good arguments against it, right? It's like it's not always religious, so wouldn't fall in that kind of clause about the establishment of religion, right? So this is not relevant. People do this for all different kinds of motives, and the arguments down the whole opposition bench support this. And you could have kind of mentioned this, like their own argumentation supports that people have a plurality of motivations for doing homeschooling. So this is not free speech. This is like just a kind of policy measure. We need to think about this as a kind of political problem, not as like a civic right. This is not actually related to the First Amendment. So then you have two other nice points. You have the kind of irregular standards of homeschooling, and you have the parent versus the teacher role. And I think that you could have given us like a little bit more kind of analysis, and this is something that whips do, and it's kind of hard to get a sense of what it is. But the irregular standards, like why are regular standards themselves something that in principle we would want? Why is a standardized education something that we want? I think it's kind of the question that's begged here. And then so if you pose it as a question like, do we want a kind of education that is standardized or that is not standardized? What does a society look like that adopts either model, right? Or that adopts kind of like a mix of both, right? Where there's some people have standardized education and there's all these other people that have completely unstandardized educations, right? What does a society look like on either? What does the world look like on these two sides of the question? But you have good arguments. I think that the abuse at home stuff is maybe not. It's kind of. I'm not really sure that it's developed as powerfully as it could be, and it allows the Cassandra to kind of take it in another direction if she wants to. So be careful about that argument, especially something that isn't mentioned before in the debate. It could seem like new argumentation when it's not kind of like part of the full debate. And parent versus teacher role. I think that you have some good stuff here about the creating of diverse opinions. You're like, no, it doesn't matter that the curriculum. Of course, it's not that the curriculum doesn't teach diversity. This is a response to the textbook argument, I think. Yeah, we do have one textbook. Curriculum doesn't necessarily teach a diversity of opinions. What it does do is the school institution itself provides kind of opportunities for interaction that you don't have elsewhere. And I think you want to develop this more, which is like you get this POI. Like, well, what if you're not in a very diverse school? Which is, so because it's kind of the ambiguity in the word diversity, right? What do you mean by diversity? Do you mean racial diversity? Then we have this problem of segregation. Do you mean political diversity? Then we have the small town problem that was mentioned, right? So yeah, or any real town, right? So but we have kind of what you mean by diversity could be something that you kind of pull arguments from the debate to talk about. Be like, this is what people have been saying about diversity in the debate and diversity of opinions, and the kind of education people get from it. And here's why, on our side, the analysis of all of this is the best. And that's something that's kind of whip work that you could do. And be careful of saying things like, this is also true for Lexa. Bullying, it's not the end of the world, right? Because so much time has been spent on bullying that you don't want to kind of dismiss bullying. Like you're like, though, especially then you get this caveat like, though there are special circumstances where it really is really bad. But you don't want to use the kind of language like it's not the end of the world, because it kind of seems to dismiss people that might think it's important, and they might be in your audience. Okay, and finally, Cassandra's speech. So I think that you do a good job of kind of coming out and saying, choosing homeschooling, right? It's gonna like choosing it, or having the ability to choose it, is really what you're defending, not necessarily homeschooling itself. But then you kind of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence almost seems like kind of play acty. Seems kind of like a performance of something, and it doesn't and even though I know you kind of have it as your team line, it doesn't really, as I said before, it doesn't really do too much for me anyway, because I'm not sure why the Declaration of Independence would be at all a relevant document for educational policy. It just seems like a really kind of, like, as Moby Dick says, or like, it just seems like, why is this document here, other than that it has kind of like a ethos about it for American audiences, that it's important in a kind of general sense. It doesn't seem like clear why we'd go to the Declaration of Independence. So I'm kind of bemused by this. However, I do think that the kind of nice picture of the injured student allows you to pull out some nice threads from throughout the debate. But you take a bunch of POIs in order, and that like some of that work that you're doing of crystallizing around this image gets lost. So yeah. So be careful about when you take your POIs. Don't take them back to back, right? You usually don't want to do this. So Plato was homeschooled by Socrates. That was pretty funny, I thought. Though I don't know that necessarily your audience seemed to really like it as a powerful argument. Again, it seems to me kind of irrelevant to most of what's being talked about, though it was funny. So, and even though I think it was, maybe you were trying to like pander to your teacher a little bit with the Homer's contest. I think you have actually a really interesting point here about removing the challenge to an institution that exists. But you kind of defer to something that everyone in the class has read. But this might be like a moment of using the arguments in the debate to analyze, like, well, what would happen if they really want to ban this, right? So if there wasn't this kind of challenge, some of the things that they're saying that they want in public education reform, we wouldn't even know that these were problems because this would just be the status quo, something like this, right? And you kind of can develop, and you do kind of develop arguments on this. And I think this is really strong. And I think that you should maybe make this a bigger part or like a more central part of your whip speech. And then, again, in your third point, when you crystallize, you kind of make it a technical point. You're like, they did not prove that homeschooling was evil. Therefore, vote for us, or something like this. It seems kind of like a technical point, a technical way of arguing to me. They didn't do a good enough job of showing why homeschooling. But you're defending a whole bunch of different things, not that they didn't do their job. You need to show us what you're defending, especially in the whip speech, and why it wins the clashes of the debate. Because the clash of the debate isn't actually whether homeschooling is evil. So the moment of kind of hyperbole and exaggeration really does actually detract from your argumentation here. So it's something to be careful of when you use kind of a hyperbolic expression of something. So yeah. Anyway, this is a very long adjudication. Hopefully you can fast forward back and forth between different things that you find interesting. But this was a very good debate, and I look forward to hearing you all debate on another topic. Good night.